Hello, my name is Michael Jones. I'm the UC Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma Counties. For this portion of the California Oak Health Workshop, I'll be talking about oak woodlands and fire. For the first part, I'll focus on a research project I'm conducting at the UC Research and Extension Center, HOPLAND, located in Mendocino County. And for the second part, I'll follow up and finish off with some general observations I've made while conducting this study and while being in the field in post-fire events. All right, so here we go. I'm going to start with a real brief and general introduction to the HOPLAND Research and Extension Center, or HREC for short, talk about the campus, as I'll be calling it, and the fire that impacted it. So the HREC is one of about 10 RECs located across the state that are managed by the UC system. They're, as in the name, they're used for research and extension. This particular site or campus was historically a sheep ranch. It's still maintained as a sheep ranch. And it consists of rangeland, oak woodland, and chaparral. And so it's pretty interesting to work there, particularly when you're walking into your site and there's a bunch of sheep and guard dogs that are staring at you. So it's a pretty great place to work. On July 27th of 2018, the river fire ignited, which was one of two fires that made up the Mendocino Complex fire. In a matter of hours, it had burned through, it started near HREC, and so in a matter of hours, it had burned through the campus, consuming about 3,400 acres, about 2/3 of the entire campus. The outlined in the red, the green is the footprint of the fire on the 28th. So just to give you a little bit of context about the river fire, in this smaller map, the green outline is again the footprint of the fire. The red is the area of the HREC that was burned. Again, that footprint is from the 28th, so about 30 hours after the point of ignition. And that area represents about 10,500 acres. If you look at a rate of spread, that's about 350 acres per hour. So it's a pretty incredible fire under some really extreme conditions. What's also interesting about the HOPLAND Research Extension Center is that there's no historical record of fire occurring on this site. There's lots of fires that were near it and around it, but there's no evidence of a large landscape level fire occurring here, at least in the recent record, so maybe the last few hundred years. Doesn't mean there weren't small fires there, or that maybe there were fires there, there's just no record. So this kind of creates a unique opportunity to look at, here's a site that potentially has burned for a few years, and we just had this really extreme fire event. Let's look at how that impacted these oak woodlands, right? There's obviously going to be a lot of variability depending on the fire behavior and lots of different conditions that affect how the fire was moving through these systems, these woodlands and the rangeland and the chaparral. And so let's look at how these oaks are impacted by this fire. I just want to point out and kind of remind us that, right, California is the ecosystems of California are fire adapted, meaning that they've been exposed to fire repeatedly and consistently for thousands of years. And one reason is because we're in a Mediterranean climate, right? It's just perfect conditions in which we have these dry, hot summers with these lightning storms that occur. And so we have conditions that creates, regular and consistent fire events. These returning fires, we have this fire return interval across the state are highly variable. In our part of California, so the intercoastal range in Mendocino County, on average, it's about every 50 years. And so that's kind of important to remember that these systems are continuously exposed to fire, maybe on decades apart. Also, remember that the Native Americans were conducting prescribed fire as a way of managing the land, and they were conducting it, in some cases, much more often than the natural fire cycles, maybe every 5 to 10 years. So I guess I'm just trying to say is think about the fact that, these flora and fauna have been exposed to fire for thousands and thousands of years, and these species have adapted to fire. And so we have this fire adapted ecosystem with these flora and fauna that are adapted to fire. And I point this out because, after a fire event, it's aesthetically, it can be disturbing. It's really incredible to see maybe an oak woodland or a system that you are really familiar with. Maybe it's on your property, maybe it's an area you visit. And to see this transformation after this fire can be really stressful and kind of really intense. But it's important to remember that this is not, a single isolated event. This has happened to these landscapes for thousands and thousands of years. And so it's really important to remember that there is, a benefit ecologically and that these systems might recover. So I want you to think about while I'm talking, If you do have oak woodlands on your property, or if there's an area where you visit, has it been exposed, or have these woodlands been exposed to fire? Have they burned recently? How are they responding? What do they look like? As I'm talking about the results that I'm presenting, how do they compare to what you've seen? If you live in an area or you visit an area where they haven't had fire in oak woodlands in recent history, think about how those woodlands respond. What would they look like? What would happen if a fire was to occur there? So just keep that in mind. Think about, I'm focusing on a case study in a specific area of the state, right? This can be kind of extrapolated to the statewide oak woodlands. All right, so here's how we set up the study. The red perimeter again is the campus boundaries. And so the red dots indicate where we located about 35 of these 5th acre plots in the burned areas. We established some unburned areas as controls. And then we collected data in 2018 in November, December. Remember that the fire started in July and burned quite a while after that. So this was a few months after the fire was officially declared out. And then we came back in 2019, 1 year later, and reassessed these same plots. What we're looking at is basic stand data. So we're collecting site characteristics, elevation, slope, aspect, and then we're looking at the trees. So what are the species? What's the status? Do they look alive? Are they dead? What's their size? How's their canopy look? Just general kind of measures of health. And then we want to look at what the fire damage was, right? The way we can assess, we can't measure directly fire intensity because that's a measure of the chemical and physical processes of fire. But what we're looking at is the damage, the leftover impact, the fire severity, the signs that are left over. That's kind of like indicates, how extreme this or how this fire impacted these particular trees. So we look at scorch height and severity. So scorch height or charring in that picture, the 3 images on the top, that's the actual consumption of the woody tissue. So how much of that was consumed, how severe was the consumption, on the left top, it's pretty minor, which is a little bit of charring on the outside, all the way to the top right, where you have really extensive consumption of the bark tissue, and the wood that's under the bark is actually burned. And then height, right? We want to know how high those flames were moving into those trees. And then we look at cambium damage. Cambium is that really thin layer of tissue right beneath the bark. It's really important for the transportation of nutrients and cell division. And so if that tissue is destroyed, it's killed or damaged, it really impedes the ability of the tree to move nutrients and is essentially like starving off and suffocating the tree. But remember, oaks are pretty damn tough trees. So you can tolerate some of this damage. We'll talk a little bit more about what we're seeing later. And then we're going to look at canopy torching, right? These trees are deciduous or evergreen, but regardless, they regenerate their foliage. So maybe losing your foliage isn't necessarily a serious impact, right? Maybe the tree will recover that foliage, but it's a sign of how high the flame lengths we're getting, or heat stress, those kinds of things that could be impacting the health and survival of the tree. And then we also want to look at epicormic and basal sprouting. So epicormic sprouting is the development of twigs coming off the main stem or the main bowl, and then larger branches, areas where it would expect foliage to appear, and these twigs then produce photosynthetic tissue. It's a stress symptom, right? But it's a sign that the tree is still trying to create surface area for photosynthesis, and it's maybe even still alive. Basal sprouting is the appearance of sprouts coming from the root collar, so from the soil, emerging from below the ground. And then the last thing we looked at was ground cover. I won't talk too much about this just because we don't have enough time in this particular talk, but we just wanted to assess what was the consumption of the vegetation in the understory, what was the composition of the understory, and maybe what some of that impact might have been from the fire. And then really, I started this study out of interest of looking at the insects and diseases. So I'm an entomologist by training, so I really wanted to look at, what happens in these systems. We've had this fire event, we have trees that are killed, trees that are stressed, trees that are alive. Will we see some kind of insect outbreak or disease outbreak? For example, there's no sod at the HOPLAND Research and Extension Center, but if there was, what would happen? Would sod flare up? Would we have issues with sun oak death? Right, because if you think about if a fire like this was to occur in a conifer system, we'd expect, potentially these massive outbreaks of bark beetles and wood-boring insects. And so I wanted to see if we'd see something similar. Of course, you have to look at vertebrate pests as well. You want to think about what the mammals are doing or the herbivores are doing to this living tissue if it's stressed. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, what we're measuring is fire severity. And so we use these data to kind of group the plots into different fire severities as a kind of indication of how intense or what that fire did to that particular area of the oak woodland, the stand, whatever you want to call it. So on the left, we have something with low fire severity where there's very little evidence of charring. The char height's very low. You can see that tree in the center of the picture is blackened on the one side, but it's only maybe a few feet high. Other than that, the trees are healthy and alive and they look great. In the middle, we have moderate, right? Much more consumption. You can see there's a lot more charring. It goes a lot more higher. Consumption of the understory is a little bit more intense. Then we have our severe or our high severity plot where, you know, all the understory is consumed. The trees, for the most part, most of the trees are charred and the canopy is completely gone. And the trees, you know, they look like firewood for the most part. They essentially are dead. All right, so here we go. We're going to talk about results. In our burn plots, so in our 35 plots that we established in the burn areas, we collected data on 468 oak trees, representing 7 species. So the most common are blue oak, California black oak, interior live oak, with canyon live, scrub oak, valley oak, and Oregon white oak less common. On average, trees were about 15 inches in diameter breast height. In this distribution graph, you see that, you know, for the most part, the trees are smaller. I mean, well, you know, I say smaller, but, you know, most trees are under 2 foot in diameter. So maybe for oaks in this particular area that are maybe a few hundred years old, they're on the smaller size. And then for height, a little bit more variable, but you can still see kind of a distribution. Mean height is about 40 foot. Most of the trees, again, are under 65 feet. All right, so when we conducted this first assessment, we really kind of, using those data that we're collecting, we estimated that about 43% of the trees we looked at were dead. And that's based on the symptoms of moderate to high burn severity, and looking at how much of the bark was consumed, how much of the cambium was killed or damaged, and then how high the charring got into that tree. So in trees that looked to be dead right after the fire, charring was about 26 feet up into the tree. So that represents, if you're looking at the average size of the tree, that represents about 2/3 of the tree was exposed to direct flame contact or heat. And of course, with flame heights going that high, you're looking at a pretty significant amount of the canopy being consumed. But it's a little bit more interesting when we look at the living trees, right? The dead trees are dead because they have no, you know, they don't appear to have any signs of life. There's no green foliage, there's lots of damage to the bark, and so they appear all in purposes, they're dead. But when we look at living trees, we have 2 kind of categories. The first is we have the trees that really don't have any sign of the fire. In this picture on the upper left, you see that it's a little hard to tell, but that's a plot that burned. You can see a little bit of charring on this tree in the foreground, but you can still see the moss. And so there wasn't a lot of heat damage, a lot of charring on that particular tree. And then this larger picture in the bottom, you see that's a pretty typical plot with low severity burn. Minor canopy torching, so a lot of foliage is still alive. The trees, for the most part, look faint. So the other category of living trees were those trees that looked like they should be dead, right? They had that real significant charring, real intense consumption of the bark. Most of the canopy was gone, if not all of it. So for example, in this picture on the left, those are black oak. It's a little bit hard to tell, but they're that dark because they are that dark. Those trees were probably like 60, 70 feet tall, and there was evidence of flame lengths or burning all the way to the top. And so that was a tree that if you look at it, you would be like, those trees are dead for all intents and purposes. But really what happened in some of these trees is that the above ground biomass appeared dead, or there was above ground biomass mortality. And it's important to make that distinction because remember, oak trees have these really extensive, impressive root structures, right? These massive root masses that, you know, potentially could still be alive even though the above ground biomass is dead. And so that's exactly what we see. Remember, we're collecting these data initially a few months after the fire, and what was really impressive, we're already seeing these basal sprouts, right? So these little pictures at the bottom, those little sprouts, those are coming from the root collars. And so even though the above ground biomass appears dead, they're regenerating. So those trees are technically still alive. And so this is pretty awesome that we're seeing already, you know, about 35% of the trees that we called living appear to have dead, but are all regenerating new tissue. So that's just kind of incredible. I mean, that's an amazing response by the trees. And so how I categorize or how we think about these 2 living classifications of trees is there's really just 2 different life history strategies that these oaks have adapted, right? They live in a fire adapted ecosystem. So maybe they have these 2 different types of life history strategies. they've evolved or adapted for these systems. The first is just tolerance, fire tolerance, right? We see that they can experience some charring of the bark, some canopy and foliage loss, maybe even a little bark damage, and they survive, right? They can tolerate it. They can accept the damage. You can see in the bottom picture that I've removed the bark from a tree, and you can see that there's quite a bit of charring on the outside. And if you look at that image, you have the bark is pretty thick. So the bark is the reddish color, the reddish brown color, and then the white part is that cambium in the wood. Notice how healthy that looks. Look at the outer part of the bark. You see that there's a black line, and the outer maybe inch or so looks like this dark blackish color. That's dead. That's dead bark. But you look under that, the bark above the cambium in the wood is still a healthy color. So that means that tree tolerated a pretty substantial amount of heat and direct flame contact that consumed and killed a lot of that outer bark, but the inside of the tree is still healthy and alive. So it's tolerating that damage. It's not going to kill that tree. And these trees, in particular, that tree in that picture is still alive and doing really well, even though I hacked into it. You know, I try not to do that too much. We don't want to introduce wounds, but that tree is still doing really well. So these are trees that appear really healthy. For the trees that look dead, right, that basically had 100% mortality of above ground biomass, as in the big picture on the bottom, those are those oaks again. And if you hack the bark away on this top left, you see that all the bark's dead, the wood is dried and dead, so there was lots and lots of heat contact that basically killed that cambium, destroyed the bark structure, and killed all that tissue, and resulting in that above ground biomass mortality. But there's regeneration from the root mass, which is still alive. And so we call that, which is I think a great term, is fire embracing, right? So if we want to think of the trees as, I'm going to anthropomorphize these trees for a second. If we think about it, the trees are either tolerating the heat, like, okay, I'm just going to stick with it. If it doesn't do too much damage, I'll be okay. Or you have this strategy where, oh man, this is really intense. I'm getting a lot of damage. I'm just going to go ahead and, you know what, it's just a loss. This above ground biomass is a loss. I'm just going to reinvest all my resources into producing new photosynthetic foliage from the root masses. And so it embraces the fact that, you know, fire is going to happen to it. Fire is going to kill it. And, you know, we're going to regenerate. So that's, I think, pretty awesome. And we're already seeing that result real rapidly after the fire. So the other thing, just real briefly, we looked at vegetative ground cover. Of course, as expected, a lot of it consumed, more than 9%. So this is a typical unburned plot before fire, and then what it looks like after a fire. What was already really cool to see in some of these burned areas is that we already had seedling establishment. We had oak, we had a brand new oak seedling recruitment in a burned plot. So that's fantastic. Even within a few months, the conditions are creating some regeneration, potential for generation. All right, so remember 2019, we're reassessing the same plots. And so what we saw was pretty neat. Remember in 2018, we predicted mortality was, I don't know, around 40%. This time around, it was down to 25%. Again, that's because we're seeing a lot of the trees that appeared to have had total above ground biomass mortality, they're regenerating, they're producing basal sprouts. So now where a third of the trees before were, appeared dead but were resprouting, and the rest were relatively low severity damage and healthy looking. Now we have about 68% of the trees that we're considering alive had that above ground mortality, but they're sprouting new foliage. As you can see on these photos on the left, quite a significant amount of foliage. I should also point out, if I've been saying we, who I'm referring to is myself, and in this picture on the top is one of my research technicians, Ryan Kiefer. And so we've been doing this work, and so just want to give him a shout out. All right, and so the trees that we're still seeing dead, that 25% mortality, really what we're seeing is in trees on this bottom right picture where it looks like there's just a ton of heat baking the base of that tree. You can see the bark's cracked, a lot of it's been consumed, there's no living foliage. Maybe the tree burned out, like there's a cat eye. I don't know if it was already there from before the fire, but the heat really sat on that tree. You can see it cooked the surface, the soil, and so it killed a lot of the seed bank for the grasses, so there's no understory regeneration. And so that's where we're seeing mortalities, where the heat was just really intense and persistent, and it kind of baked the tissues in the above ground mortality, the above ground biomass, but presumably it killed the root structure as well. All right, so I'll finish talking about the research project, looking at insects and diseases. And like I said, my original impetus for starting this project was to look at this exact issue. And just to give it away, you know, it was interesting, but just not interesting at all. Nothing like I would have expected if I was in a conifer stand that had just burned. It was cool, but I got to tell you, these trees are real tough. All right, so here's what we found. In the center picture, you see this is an oak tree. Right, peel the bark off. On the upper left side of that tree, you can see this black line kind of splitting that wood in half. On the upper left, you see the bark is this healthy red color, and the woody tissue in the cambium is this nice rich creamy color. And then the right side, you know, that bark is that dark red, blackish color, and the woody tissue is dark. So that's a division between the right, which is dead, and the left, which is still alive tissue. And you see these tracks in that dead side. That's flat-headed borer galleries, so cerambicids and probably some depressids in there as well. And so they're feeding on that dead tissue. And we saw this was pretty common across the site. Wherever there was dead oaks and there was dead tissue, we saw cerambicids, flat-headed borers, wood borer activity. But you don't see a crossing in this picture, for example. You don't see a crossing in living tissue. So there wasn't a lot of insect activity, at least in wood borers, on the living tissue. So the trees, even if they're stressed, probably half of this tree is dead. There's still, the insects are still feeding in that dead tissue, and they're not even trying to feed on the living side because the tree is still alive and presumably it's still resistant. It has a lot of chemicals to protect it. We did see a lot of other interesting things in this, on the right, or excuse me, the left top middle. You see that's a pupal casing from a Ceciad. It's a clearwing borer, clearwing moth. They really like this kind of charred dead bark. They feed in it and they love it. So they're only feeding on these dead trees. On the top left, we see these are black oak resprouts. We see they're kind of that dusty color, that's powdery mildew. This is very common in oak sprouts. I see it in a lot of systems, not just in post-fire conditions. The concern here is that a lot of the resources the tree's investing in this new vegetation is photosynthetic tissue to help replenish, right? You need to return those resources back into the root structure because it's investing all this energy to produce this foliage. But if you have the powdery mildew impacting that growth or preventing photosynthesis from occurring, you can really kind of deplete the resources of the tree. We'll see, you know, powdery mildew is an issue when you have warm, wet springs. And so we saw this for in 2019. I expect I'll probably see it again this year. And it was pretty severe last year. So I'm a little worried on those trees that were really heavily impacted, but I think they'll probably be okay. In the bottom picture, you see just a real bushy interior live oak sprouting. So those three large stems in the background, those were all above ground biomass mortality. And then they invested all this energy in all this resprouting. If you can see on that big clump of sprouts on the left side, the sprouts are long and look healthy. On the right side, they look crimped back. That's deer browse. So in a lot of these plots, there's really extensive deer browsing on this regeneration. Again, just like with the powdery mildew, there's a lot of investment in resources from the rootstock. And, you know, these photosynthetic tissues are really important for replenishing those resources. And so, you know, continued and extensive browse pressure could potentially deplete the resources of the tree and lead to mortality. Something else we're looking at. All right, so I'm gonna finish this part of the talk just talking about some management considerations. And based on what we've seen and with the litter, you know, I'm not the first one to conduct this kind of research. This has been happening for a long time. I'm just adding to this body of literature. And based on what I've seen and what the literature suggests, and maybe what you've seen too, if you've had oak woodlands have been burned or you've been in areas where oak woodlands have burned, is that the most important thing to do post-fire oak woodland management is nothing. Literally do absolutely nothing. You need to let these systems regenerate naturally. Now, when you do interfere is when the tree is potentially a hazard tree. So that means if it could fall on cause bodily harm or property damage or impede your ingress egress, or if maybe there's burned trees inside your defensible space or a fire break, you do need to remove that vegetation because you don't want that as a source of fuel for a future fire. But otherwise on the landscape, leave those trees alone. Let them do their thing. They're fire adapted. They, as we've seen within a year, I'm really excited to see what happens this fall. These systems recover very quickly. Aesthetically, I know it's not as pleasing as it was before, but ecologically, these systems are healthy and they're recovering. All right, so leave dead trees standing when possible. This helps to protect the regeneration. I mentioned that deer browse is a pretty serious issue. If you leave that main dead stem there, it prevents the deer from getting all of that regeneration and protects those sprouts. So that's really important to do. If you cut that tree down, they can get to all that regeneration and crop it back pretty heavily. It's also, these dead trees are wildlife habitat. Living oak trees are really important habitat, so are dead trees. Where you do want to maybe think about, you know, interfering or getting into some management activities is after a year or maybe a few years, if you see that there's areas where there's no natural regeneration, where there's no epicormic sprouting, there's no basal sprouting, or there's no seedling recruitment, right, natural regeneration from the understory, maybe it's time to go in and plant, right? Maybe you need to start planting acorns. I would caution, though, that if you're going to do this, and maybe even for natural regeneration, you need to protect these seedlings and these sprouts from browse, right? They will get browsed back pretty heavily. They're really a favorable source of nutrition for wildlife and livestock. So if you are going to go in and do some management activities, give it some time, let the system recover. If that's not enough, then you go back and plant, but you have to be really aggressive about managing the vegetation on the surface, the soil, to reduce competition and protecting from browse. All right, so thank you for listening to this part of my talk. For the next part, I will focus on just some observations I made while conducting the study. I don't have a lot of data to support what I'm about to say. I'm just saying these are what I've seen, and I think they're pretty interesting and you know, something that you might want to think about when you're out in your oak woodlands. All right, thank you.